Okay. Welcome everyone to the third session of the Moral Narratives Workshop. We have two talks on deception today, which we wanted to include because moral narratives leave a lot of room for deception. And so we thought it'd be a really interesting topic. We have two speakers who study this from quite different approaches, one from a developmental perspective and one using psycholinguistics methods. So we have first up Gail Heyman, who is a professor of psychology at University of California in San Diego, where she investigates topics at the intersection of social and cognitive development, things like how children make sense of the world and factors that affect their moral behavior. And then we have Hannah Rohde, who is a reader in linguistics and English language at the University of Edinburgh. And she works in experimental pragmatics using psycholinguistics techniques to investigate questions in areas like inference, ambiguity, and of course, deception and establishment of discourse coherence. And so we're really, really excited to have both of them today. And so we'll get started with Gail first, if you want to start sharing your screen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, how does that look to everyone? Great. All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this series. It's pretty exciting. So today I'm going to talk to you about one slice of my research on deception and the development of reputation management. And one foundation of reputation management is understanding that deception is possible. If you don't understand that you can deceive other people, you're pretty limited in what you can do in order to affect how your impressions on others. So one of the ways that we've been looking at this question in our lab has been to look at deception as a cognitive challenge. So a lot of people think of deception in terms of its morality, but it's also, when you're talking about young children, it's actually hard to deceive, because in order to effectively lie or deceive, you need to be able to think about the minds of others, and you also need to stop yourself from revealing the truth, which are challenges for young children. So one method that we've been used to look at this is to look at children who do not yet know how to lie, but sort of are on the verge of learning how to lie, and watch them learn how to lie and see how that relates to their cognitive skills. So the study I'm going to show you, I'm actually going to show you a video of what the study looks like, because I think it's pretty cool to actually see how it looks. Most of the work that I'm going to be telling you about today was done in China. That's where a lot of my collaborators are. And so you'll notice the Chinese and when I show you the video. And a lot of it was done with Kong Li, who some of you may know. He's actually the one in the video I'm going to show you next. And he's actually in Toronto, but he's the one who got me into this whole line of research on lying. So in this research, we have children about 36 months old, and they played a deception game every day for 10 days. The technical name for this method is a microgenetic method, for those of you who haven't heard it, but it's basically where you watch development happen over time by sort of these short-term longitudinal studies. And then we're seeing if these cognitive skill tests that we give them predict their ability to learn how to lie on the task. And how the task works is children hide a candy, and then the experimenter asks them where the candy is. And if the experimenter finds the candy, the experimenter wins the game and gets to eat the candy. But children have to deceive the experimenter about where it is in order to win the game. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Hopefully it's still play okay.
Kong Li covers his eyes, and Tang Tang hides the candy. When Li asks, "Where's the candy?" Tang Tang readily points to the cup where he hid it. He keeps giving away his favorite candy because he's incapable of telling a lie. After 10 trials, it's time to call it a day. And Tang Tang gets a sticker for his effort. This is day 3 for Tang Tang. He looks wistfully at the candy. Telling a lie is actually a very complex affair. For Tang Tang to lie, he first has to inhibit the truth. Then he has to know that what he knows is something that Li doesn't. He has to hold the truth in his mind while he invents a lie. This ability signals a crucial milestone in a child's development. Clearly, Tang Tang isn't there yet. Tang Tang has now been playing the game for 5 days. The first glimmer of a strategy appears when he covers the cup with his hand as if to hide the candy. But he still can't refrain from telling the truth. The next time when Lee asks where the candy is, he wavers. Something is beginning to stir. Will he actually figure out how to deceive Lee? He points to a cup. It's empty. He's won the candy this time. The look of triumph is unmistakable.
Okay, so I think that gives you a sense of what it looks like to when children play this game. And basically our findings are that children with greater cognitive skills learn to deceive more quickly. And again, the cognitive skills are these theory of mind, false belief, for those of you who know this, and then these inhibitory control skills, which essentially is like you show them a picture of a daytime and they have to say night, or you show them a picture of nighttime and they have to say day. So children who are good at those cognitive skills learn to lie more quickly in this over time. We've also done follow-up studies where instead of watching children learn how to lie on their own, we actually teach them to learn how to deceive. And then we actually find the reverse effect, that by teaching children how to deceive, that helps them with false belief and these inhibitory control skills. And so our findings suggest that at least in young children, deception and cognitive skills are closely intertwined. Okay, so once children know how to deceive, they have to determine when and how to apply it. And being honest can conflict with other values such as kindness, loyalty, and modesty. And these are all issues that we've looked at in our research. For example, you might decide, oh, do I want to tell this lie to tell this person that they look nice when I don't think they do, or that they gave a good talk when I don't really think they did? So those are some of the conflicts that children can sometimes have. And some of the ones that I'm particularly interested in relate to whether or not deception is likely to be reputation enhancing. Can children improve their reputations by telling a lie, or being truthful in some cases, which I'll talk about a little bit later? So one type of lie that we've looked at that actually is linked to cultural values are modesty-related lies. And in East Asian cultures, there's particular benefit in signaling that you're modest because it's highly culturally valued. So one of the ways that we've looked at this question is we have a method in which we try to set up the same situation in different cultures and then compare the way children respond in these different situations. In practice, it's super tricky to set up the same situation in different cultures for all kinds of reasons. I should write a paper just on that. But in this study, we had 7 to 11-year-olds in China and Canada encouraged to clean up a classroom until they actually cleaned it up when just the experimenter was there. And then a teacher at the school came in. It's like, wow, the classroom looks great. Did you clean up the classroom? And then the question is whether the child said, yes, I cleaned up the classroom or not. And almost all of the Canadian children took credit and said, yes, I cleaned up the classroom. But many Chinese children told modest lies and shook their head and said that they didn't do it, and that this tendency increased with age, which suggests that children are learning culturally specific ways to communicate about themselves, including denying their own good deeds. And in fact, in other research, we asked children about whether someone should deny their own good deeds and not take credit for it. And again, you see this huge cultural difference where in China, they're saying you should be modest, you should let the group take credit for it, you shouldn't take personal credit for it. And in Canada and the US, where we've tested kids, often they're just like, why? I don't even understand why someone would say no when they did something. Like, of course you want credit for everything you do. Okay, even within a culture, it can be hard to know what others expect and value. And that's been something I'm really interested in lately, is how you figure out what you're going to get credit for and what you're going to get, what's going to improve your reputation and what's not. And it's very idiosyncratic with different people. Like if you're an amazing video game player, they're probably people you know who you could tell that to, who would be like, wow, and their opinion of you would go way up. And they're probably people who you know who just think video game playing is the biggest waste of time in the world, and might even think worse of you, like, wow, you're wasting all your time doing this. So it's a challenge even for adults to figure out. And so how do you have children sort of learn about this is one of the questions I've been looking at in my research. And so since this talk is primarily about deception, I'm going to focus on the ways in which we've looked at this with reference to deception, and looking at questions of our children's decisions about honesty influenced by their assumptions about what they think other people are thinking. Okay. So one of the paradigms that we use to study this is called the temptation resistance paradigm. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's a guessing game. Children have to guess the right answer without peeking at something that's hidden. And on the critical trial where the child has the chance to win the game, the experimenter leaves the room and reminds the child the rule is no peeking. Don't forget, you're not allowed to peek. So one example of a version that we do, we have a card hidden behind a barrier, and children have to guess whether the hidden card is greater than or less than the number 8. And then they're told not to peek. The experimenter's like, oh, I have to take an emergency phone call. I'll be right back. And what happens in the standard versions of this paradigm is that the vast majority of children, roughly, well, over 80% in almost every study in any country we do it, peek while the experimenter's away. So I'm just going to show you an example of what it looks like. A few kids, what they look like when they peek. There's no sound here. You'll just see what 3 children look like while they're peeking while the experimenter left. So the last one is clearly proud of himself for peeking at the answer, and then the experimenter comes in and they can get the answer right. Okay. So using that paradigm, we've been asking a lot of different questions about children's cheating rates and when they cheat. So are children less likely to cheat when told they have a reputation for being a good kid? So our idea was maybe if they thought other people thought they were a good kid, that might promote their idea that they want to be the kind of person who doesn't cheat. So we had 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in China, and we had children randomly assigned to 2 conditions. One was a reputation condition, where they were simply told by the experimenter when they started, I know some kids in your class, and they told me you're a good kid. And in the control condition, they weren't given any reputation information. And this is what the results look like. So you'll see the white bars are the control condition. That's what they do when they're not given any information. So as I said, it's consistent with other studies where over 80% of the children, and whether it's 3, 4, or 5-year-olds are cheating in it. But what you see when you have the reputation condition in which they're told that other children think they're a good kid is it doesn't have any effect on 3-year-olds, but by the time children are 5, it's having a substantial effect on reducing their cheating rate. Okay. All right, so once we found that, we're interested in, well, okay, so concerns about reputation can make children cheat less, but could it also make them cheat more? And our idea here is that if we told children they had a reputation for being smart, that might actually increase cheating, because children want to get the answers right, because they think of that as what it means to be smart, is to get the answers right, and they could get the answers right more. But there's one problem with looking at this question, and the problem is ceiling effects. So as I said, over 80% of kids are already cheating, and you're trying to see, well, can we increase cheating? It's very, very hard to look at, can you increase cheating when you have such high levels already? So we did a little trick. So to deal with this problem of having too high rates and trying to get an increase, what we did is, from our other research, we found that children who promise not to cheat, you get a substantial reduction in cheating. And this is true even when children don't really understand promises, but somehow if you get them to say, I promise not to cheat, they're much less likely to cheat. So that's a whole nother talk. But so we did this in all conditions. We sort of added this manipulation to get them down in terms of the cheating level. And then we did our manipulation that we were really interested in for the study, which is looking at whether or not having a reputation for being smart would have an effect. So in the smart condition, again, the children are randomly assigned to these 3 conditions. Last time we just had no reputation and the key manipulation. This time we included another control, which is saying, okay, what if it's not smart? What if it's a different kind of reputation? Actually, what we told, well, the smart reputation condition, they were told, I know some kids in your class, and they told me you're a smart kid. In the irrelevant reputation condition, they were told, I know some kids in your class, and they told me you're a clean kid, which sounds really weird in the US, but in China, I'm assured that preschool children really want a reputation for being clean. Maybe this will be true now with all the pandemic hygiene and everything going on now. I'm not sure. And then a no reputation control. Okay, and so here's what the data looks like. So you want to really pay attention to that dark bar is the smart reputation. Again, you have the number of children cheating. These numbers are way lower, and that's because of the promise that they did that overall reduced levels. But what you can see is that the smart reputation bar is higher than the bars in the other two conditions. And this is true even starting at age 3, which wasn't true with the good reputation. Now we're getting these effects even in younger children. So another thing we've been doing is looking more broadly at how children determine what others expect and value and how this affects their behavior. And one strategy children use to figure this out is observational learning. So that's something we've been looking at in our research, is how children are influenced by what they observe their peers doing. And this turns out to be very tricky research to do, so I'm doing very little of it now because we're actually looking at children observing their own peers react in a certain way and how that affects their behavior. And experimentally, when you have to control how their peers behave, it turns out to be very tricky. Anyway, so in this study, we looked at 5-year-olds and their tendencies to confess to cheating using this temptation resistance paradigm that I told you about. So after they've cheated, the question is, when an experimenter asks them, did you peek? Do they tell the truth or do they lie? And what we found is children are more likely to confess if they've actually observed their peer confess and receive praise for doing so. So in this study, their peer is actually confessing, and then an experimenter is like saying, oh, that's great that you told me the truth. And then children will confess themselves. However, if they just observe their peer confessing and they don't see their peer being praised for it, then they're no more likely to confess themselves. So that's one example of observational learning. Another strategy that children use, thank goodness, easier to study in our research, and one that we've been doing a lot with, is effects of overheard conversation. So we see overheard conversation as an extension of observational learning that greatly expands the opportunities children have and adults have to learn about others beyond what could be directly observed. So you can think of it, those of you who study gossip, this is very much a form of gossip. It's just that it's gossip not told to the child, it's gossip about other people, because we're really looking at what children are learning from evaluative comments about other people and how that's affecting their beliefs and behaviors in a lot of different areas. But again, because I'm focusing on deception, I'll just give you those examples. First, I have to describe the basic method that we're using for this. So before the experimental session has apparently begun, the experimenter has a brief conversation with someone else. This is actually the experimental manipulation. So they're randomly assigned to hear a particular type of conversation, and then we can assess how that conversation affects their beliefs and behavior. Typically, we have it either be, it's always a evaluative conversation about another person, and they never say who the other person is. This isn't someone that the child already knows. The child comes in the room and the experimenter is saying something like, oh, that kid I just tested earlier, that is such a good kid, or that kid I just tested earlier, they were such a, they were so smart, or so evaluative comments about other people, but nobody the child knows. They're hearing this conversation. And then we also have a control conversation, which doesn't have anything with evaluative comments, just to control for overhearing a conversation. And sometimes we do these conversations as a phone call where the experimenter's on the phone and the child overhears a phone call. And sometimes we do it where there's another experimenter who comes by. It doesn't seem to make a difference. Okay, so the kinds of example findings we have that are relevant to deception with this overheard conversation. So we've found that overhearing praise for another child for admitting to cheating made 3 and 5-year-olds more likely to confess to cheating themselves. Okay, another example. So this time, instead of telling the child they had a reputation for being smart, we actually had a conversation about an experimenter praising another child for being smart. So the experimenter saying, wow, that kid I just tested earlier today was so smart. And that actually leads to the same effect of getting kids to cheat more as telling them they're smart. So we still haven't figured out exactly why, but somehow it's telling the child that the experimenter really values being smart and that they're judging children about how smart they are on this in this experiment. So anyway, those are two examples, but we've been doing this in a lot of non-deception contexts too, and showing a lot of effects. So conclusions. So the ability to deceive emerges early in life and is closely tied to cognitive development. Expectations about when to deceive are different, can differ across cultures. Children make inferences about what is expected and socially valued by observing others and by listening to evaluative comments about others. And these inferences can systematically influence their behavior. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Gail. I think we do actually have a couple time for a couple questions if folks want to raise their hand. Question from Emily.
Hi, thanks for this great talk, Gail, and I love this work. I'm wondering, it seems like you're talking about deception in this way as being something like a moral trade-off. So in the sense that it sounds like kids are using deception as a moral virtue in and of itself, so being truthful, but they're also using it to manage their reputations, and they're trading it off against other sorts of values. And I'm wondering if you think about that trade-off as being something that has a particular developmental trajectory. So this idea that kids are weighing these two values against each other, is there something interesting about the development of that type of weighing of two values that might shed light on some of this work? It's really interesting. And it does that sort of reflect on how kids might do other types of moral trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. And, I think that it isn't actually just a trade-off between two things. I think they're told, children all over the world are told, don't lie, but they get completely complicated mixed messages about this. In another line of research, we look at parents lie to their children all the time. At the same time, they're saying you should never lie. And so they're being taught these messages, and some are getting religious messages and all these other things, but there's also all these other values, like you're supposed to be kind to people, like you're supposed to be loyal to people. And so figuring out sort of how to balance, oh, is this good? Is it, even if my parents said lying is always bad, they asked me to lie to get a cheaper ticket into this show, because sometimes children get less money, or they asked me, I just watched my mom say that she was really unhappy that my aunt is coming to visit, and now all of a sudden she's saying, oh, I'm so glad you're here, as soon as the aunt comes. So children are just navigating this super complex world, and they're given of deception, and they're given these very simple messages, and I think very little instruction about how to deal with it. Well, what happens when this competes with other things? So I think for the very young children, when they're figuring it out, it may not be about this moral thing. It may just be about, understanding that you can do it, or it may just be different in games. And then as they get older, they're learning about all these different cultural values and figuring out what really gets valued by people, because sometimes people say things are valued, but then that's not actually what gets valued in the culture. So they might say, oh, you just need to be a good kid, but then the kids who are actually popular are the kids who are doing different other kinds of things. Anyway, that's probably too long of an answer. I'll take another question or two, maybe.
Yeah, so from Manisha.
Yeah, hi Gail, this was really cool. I have a question about sort of the implications this might have for identity development, because reputation is not identity, but you do have some compelling evidence that kids who are really young are kind of thinking about identity-like things in their behavior. And I mean, maybe thinking is too deliberate and self-aware a way to phrase it, but that there's some sort of attunement to things that might later coalesce into identity. And I wondered if you thought about that, or have any responses to that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's super fascinating, right? So if you told you have a certain reputation and then you start acting a certain way, and then other people start treating you even more like you have that reputation, I can just see all these feedback loops that you can get into based on these kinds of things. And I think of children as constantly like exploring, like, what is it like if I'm this kind of person? What is it like? What is the reaction? And then they get these reactions. And then, like I said, then it can end up shaping how they think about themselves and how other people treat them. So I think that's super interesting. Yeah.
Cool. I think maybe we'll do the question in the at the end, because I think now we're going to hand it off to Hannah. Thank you again, Gail.
Should I stop? Let me stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, so I wish I had videos of kids. Uh, so I'm gonna share screen, and is this coming up okay? Cool. All right, let me get a timer going. And so what I'm going to try to do is kind of give a vantage point from experimental pragmatics, talking about cooperativity in language and what even counts as deception. And I'm going to start with the observation that sometimes we don't say what we mean, and we may even say things that are untrue. So if a speaker says, "I hid the treasure here," it's possible that there's some alternative meaning, that they hid the treasure elsewhere, and they're trying to conceal that alternative meaning. So they're on record as having said something false. But there are other contexts where we are on record as saying something false, but we don't necessarily mean it in a deceptive way. So in metaphor, a speaker can say, "I'm a saint for all the things that I do." And that's a case where there's an alternative meaning, that I have saint-like properties, even if I'm not really a saint. And I'm not trying to conceal that meaning, I'm actually trying to convey that meaning. And then the other context where there is some sort of alternative meaning that comes alongside the meaning that we're conveying. So if a speaker says, "Wow, Hannah is wearing red today," a listener might think, well, that's not a terribly newsworthy observation to make. Maybe the speaker has some reason that they think that this is noteworthy. Maybe they think that Hannah doesn't typically wear red. And so there's this additional meaning that the speaker is conveying, beyond what they're on record as having said. And then things get really interesting when you have cases where the additional meaning that you might be implicating is actually itself false. And so if someone says, "Wow, Hannah did not eat a dozen donuts for breakfast today," the listener may be in a position to think, well, there are millions of people who didn't eat a dozen donuts for breakfast today, and so why is the speaker remarking that Hannah didn't do it and why she didn't do it today? Maybe there's this inference that she typically eats a dozen donuts for breakfast each day, and today was different, and that meaning could be itself false. And so this is all getting at this general question of what counts as deception. Is it simply not telling the truth? But we have these examples where sometimes not telling the truth is about concealing something, but there are other cases where it's actually a way of conveying meaning through metaphor. Is it about telling the whole truth of what you mean? Well, there are cases where you can carry additional meaning that itself may be true or false. And so I'm going to be trying to draw this distinction between an intention to mislead versus a more general pattern in language where speakers may be trying to convey additional meaning beyond what they're actually on record as having said. And I think about this in terms of cooperativity, that there are longstanding models in linguistics and pragmatics about the conventions that speakers agree to abide by, and their shared agreement to use these conventions means that listeners can often read between the lines. So the conventions say that speakers should speak the truth, they should give an appropriate amount of information, they should deliver it in an appropriate manner, they should be relevant, and together these maxims of cooperative communication uh, are part of what allows listeners to sometimes see additional meaning beyond what the speaker has said. And I'll be focusing on quality, quantity, and manner in different ways in this talk. So as an example of how this kind of cooperative inferencing works. So here's the speaker who says, Hannah is wearing red today, a true statement. The listener thinks, well, that's kind of not a really appropriate amount of information that I can infer that just from looking at the screen. Why is the speaker saying this? Well, maybe I would understand as a listener that the speaker wants me to believe that the fact that Hannah's wearing red is somehow interesting or it's atypical. And if indeed that's what the speaker knows about the world, that Hannah's wearing red and that she doesn't typically wear red, then you have this alignment between what the speaker had in mind and what the listener comes to understand. And it's very efficient. So all the speaker said was this short utterance, but they managed to convey some other additional meaning because the listener was doing this reasoning about what a cooperative speaker would be trying to do. And so in these cases, the conventions are letting listeners take this brief utterance and say, okay, well, that itself might not be enough. Maybe that even seems to be a violation of one of these maxims of cooperativity. Maybe that doesn't seem to be the truth or doesn't seem to be very informative, but I can reason about why a cooperative speaker might say that and potentially mean something else or mean something in addition. But there are other cases where this reliance on the cooperative rules can be misleading, that you can abuse these rules and convey additional meaning, that you're not on record as having accused me of eating a dozen donuts for breakfast every day, but I might be, a listener might draw that inference and think that that is the state of affairs. On the other hand, you can also have contexts where speakers are genuinely communicating falsehoods. They would violate a cooperative rule, and then listeners would understandably be trying to detect these violations. So what I was going to do in this talk is think about how listeners recover speakers' meaning. So what do speakers sound like when they're lying? What do listeners think that speakers sound like when they're lying? And more broadly, where do we see additional meaning arising when speakers are conveying something beyond what they're actually on record as having said? And the upshot, it's 2 points. One is that cues to lying may be deceptive, and that additional meaning can arise often from these expectations about cooperativity, particularly if a listener is trusting that a speaker has sufficient knowledge and if they're attuned to the speaker's manner. So if you ask a listener what they think a stereotypical liar sounds like, they often associate lying with slower speech, pauses, suspicious coughs, higher pitched voice, cases where the listener might even expect that a speaker is more likely to be disfluent, to say and fitting with this kind of idea that and reflect some problem in production. And it's possible then that the complexity of lying, it's cognitively costly to come up with something that is untrue, is different from how you see the world as it is, that could be enough to induce disfluency in a liar. And so listeners would be on the lookout for those kind of lies or those kind of cues to lying. But if you actually look at studies on what happens when speakers are lying, it's a total mixed bag. Sometimes there are more disfluencies, sometimes there are fewer, sometimes there's no reliable difference at all. And people have wondered if maybe the kinds of methods that people are using to try to understand lying, these are contexts where a speaker might be cued to lie. You have to lie on this trial or not on this other trial. And it was actually nice seeing the video that Gail was showing where the child is motivated to lie because they want to outwit the experimenter. Um, in the kind of methods here, it's often unclear. Maybe it'll be a mock police interview, and the participant has been told that they have to fabricate a story, but what is their motivation in that case? And it's also possible that there are different underlying reasons that these kind of cues might arise. So if it's true that lying is complex, and then that would fit with kind of what's called the cognitive hypothesis. So there is evidence that the more complex the lie, the more hesitations people make, and uh, that that kind of complexity is something that in turn speakers might be aware of. So another proposal would be that speakers are attempting to control some of their behaviors. They believe that some of these behaviors might reveal that they are being deceptive, and then they would make an effort to control their speech and control their body language. And there's evidence that they may try to regulate their behavior. And these aren't mutually exclusive. It could be possible that in the previous studies where you see an association between lying and disfluency, those are cases where the complexity of the lie really did trip up the speaker. There might be other experiments where the speakers did their best to clamp down on any possible disfluency, and they resisted being disfluent and revealing their deception. So the goal in this first study that I'm going to tell you about is to test how speakers produce and how listeners perceive cues to lying, but try to do a more naturalistic paradigm. So this is work with Gia Loy and Martin Corley here in Edinburgh, and we had pairs of participants come in to play a game where uh, there is treasure hidden behind different cards. And so in the speaker's view, they know where the treasure is hidden, but the guesser doesn't know. And the speaker's goal is to outwit the guesser. And so the speaker may be thinking about, should I lie to this guesser? They might say something like, the treasure is behind the one hump camel. And then the listener has to figure out, is this likely to be a lie? And so we had pairs of these naive participants, and they're just given these instructions that the speaker is going to describe the location of the treasure, and their goal is to mislead and outwit the guesser. And they can mention the true location, the false location, they can double bluff, they can do whatever they want to do to try to outwit the listener. And we recorded their speech and gestures. So when we look at actually how often people tell the truth, speakers are truthful a little over half the time, and guessers judge people to be truthful about a little over half the time. But they're actually pretty bad at guessing when a speaker is telling the truth. So their lie detection is not even a chance. And so we looked at a number of features of the speaker's behavior to see what would predict whether or not a speaker was telling the truth or telling a lie, and what would predict listeners' attempt at lie detection. And of these, I'm going to end up highlighting what happened with filled pauses and silent pauses, these kind of disfluencies, and also some of the body movements and affect displays. And so what we found is that when an utterance contains a pause, guessers take this and they jump to the conclusion that this is more likely to be a lie. So they're not as likely to guess that the treasure is behind the mentioned location. They guess that it's behind the other one. But it turns out that speakers are actually more likely to be telling the truth when they pause, that they manage to resist being disfluent when they're telling a lie, but then when they're relaxed and telling the truth, that's when they seem to allow themselves to pause and be disfluent. So there's this mismatch between the speakers and the guessers. And the guessers seem to be operating under this assumption that lying is really hard. I just started disfluency. I'm going to guess that it's the other location. Whereas the speakers are managing to control their behavior in order to resist emitting these cues that someone might pick up on. And it's, I guess, surprising because the guessers themselves are people who, in other contexts in life, might be the speakers, that they might be in positions where they would be telling a lie, but they're failing to estimate how they would behave in such a situation. In terms of the gestures, we categorize these into groups, and the ones that were most explanatory for the behavior that we saw had to do with these adapter movements, scratching your head, shifting your body, and displays of affect. And so it turns out that with adapters, speakers are more likely to be lying. So when these adapters are present, so they've managed to resist being disfluent, but then they can't help but kind of leak out these little movements and adjustments when they're lying. But guessers aren't paying any attention to these. What guessers are basing their decision on, in part, is the affect display. So when they see the speaker smile, move their mouth, then the guessers are more likely to guess the truth, but actually that's not predictive at all of what the speaker's behavior is. So again, this mismatch between what speakers and guessers are doing, which may in some ways reflect that we are unpracticed in understanding what is happening in non-cooperative situations, that maybe our conventions of communication are based around the assumption that people are being cooperative. And so this glimpse into the lying is a kind of case where there's really something uh, non-cooperative about the game that people are playing. But the second half of this talk, what I wanted to get into is a more general issue of cases where even when speakers are being cooperative, they may not say what they mean. There may be additional meaning that they convey beyond what they actually say explicitly. And when we think about I guess, the amount of information that someone would be portraying, this goes back to the example of the beginning of the talk, that an uninformative utterance, like a speaker saying that Hannah is wearing red today, which is something that you can infer from seeing me, is that these kind of utterances might elicit pragmatic inferences. There must be a reason that the speaker is telling me this, because otherwise she'd be violating the maximum of quantity. So maybe there's some other meaning that she's trying to convey this is surprising for Hannah, that she doesn't typically wear red. And one of my favorite studies is one that looks at narratives that mention or don't mention inferable information. And they're testing how this alters listeners' guesses about what's typically the case. So these were this was a study with descriptions of common activities. So they would story about John going shopping. He goes to the grocery store. He buys the fruit and the vegetables, and then he goes home. And they would have a version of the description where there's no mention of the protagonist doing a particular kind of inferable part of the activity, like paying the cashier. But then they had a version where they would explicitly mention it. So John goes to the shop, he goes to buy his fruits and his vegetables, and then he paid the cashier, and then he went home. And so they asked the listeners to rate, well, how typical is it that John does this action? And so if you don't mention his paying the cashier, people say, yeah, how typical is it that John pays? He's a regular guy. He probably normally pays. But if you mention that John paid the cashier, in those cases, people are likely to reduce the rate at which they guess that John typically pays. And so it's this what's often called an atypicality inference. The speaker has said that X is the case, but what listeners infer is that what's normally the case is not X. And this is kind of this example of a mismatch between what we say and what we know to be true generally in the world. And I think about this when I take the bus sometimes in Edinburgh. So when I get on the bus with my kids, and sometimes I'll see that there's a woman bus driver, and I'll want to kind of convey, like, look, anyone can be a bus driver. And I'll say, look, I want to say, look, it's a woman bus driver. And then because I've been thinking a lot about these issues of informativity, I'll worry that even though what I said is, look, there's a woman bus driver, there's an available inference that what I am remarking on is the atypical state of affairs, and then what I might end up conveying is that actually most bus drivers aren't women, which is exactly the opposite of what I wanted to convey. So this is a topic that I've been getting into with some work with Alice Reese here in Edinburgh, where we look at what additional meaning arises when a speaker reports something that might on the surface seem uninformative. So I saw that the library walls are blue. What was said is simply a statement about the library walls, but it's such a mundane, unnewsworthy utterance that there might be a listener who would think, well, what am I supposed to infer? Why did the speaker tell me this? Maybe they told me this because these walls aren't typically blue, or they have changed state. They weren't always blue. And these kind of inferences are available depending in part on the listener's ability to estimate that the speaker is cooperative, that there's a reason the speaker said this, that the speaker has enough knowledge to know whether or not the walls have changed, and that the speaker is the kind of speaker who would filter what they say in a cooperative way. And so we have been doing a bunch of studies looking at speaker knowledgeability and manner and how these inferences arise. So we set up contexts where a speaker is either familiar or unfamiliar with a location. So are they talking about the color of the library walls at school or on a field trip to the Prime Minister's office? And is this speaker a normal speaker or someone who we've characterized as a particularly quiet speaker who doesn't usually speak up? And we have participants read utterances and just judge if the situation being described used to be the same or different. And so what I'm showing here is the proportion of responses where someone said that the situation used to be different. So they've gotten the inference that a speaker has said the library walls are blue, and they're taking from that statement that the library walls are blue, that actually what's usually the case is that these walls aren't blue, or they weren't blue in the past. And we see that there's more inference if the speaker is portrayed as knowledgeable. So the blue bars are higher than the orange bars. And there's more inference if the speaker is someone who's the quiet speaker. So these bars are higher than the normal speaker. And it's these cases where mentioning that something is the case allows listeners to draw an inference that maybe the speaker knows that what is normally the case is not X. And so this has led on to some other work. This is a class project from last year, trying to ask, what do speakers talk about? Do they typically describe how the world is, or do they talk about how the world isn't? So we looked at a large corpus of Reddit data, and we pulled out mentions of actions and instruments. So eating soup with a spoon or eating soup with a fork. And we asked a bunch of participants to rate how typical is this instrument. So how typical is it to use a brush to paint a picture? Very typical, very atypical. And then we looked at how many instances were there where a speaker was mentioning the absence of something. So eating soup without a spoon versus eating soup without a fork. And what we see is that people mention situations that are generally, you can see the counts here favor the blue, the very typical, if they're mentioning the lack of that tool. Where mentioning the presence, people mention the use of something atypical, like a fork. So there's this disconnect between what speakers say about the world. People are marching around talking about instances of eating soup with a fork, even though we know that that's not really how the world really is, which in turn raises these questions about how listeners and learners might be using language to try to figure out how the world is if the kinds of things that people comment on are the kinds of things that are atypical for how the world is, and both children as learners and machines as learners. So I will just wrap up that I've been talking about how communication isn't always cooperative. Speakers lie, listeners are bad at detecting lies. And even beyond a deceptive intent, speakers don't always say what they mean. They convey additional meaning. They may choose to use language in ways that means that they're talking about what they know to not generally be the case. And these were some of the collaborators, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We'll also be taking questions for Hannah first, and then, sorry, I've been saying your name wrong. After a couple, we can also take questions for Gail again too. Walter has a question.
Hi, great talk. Very interesting work. I look forward to reading the papers. I was just wondering whether the markers for lying might be different when you're talking to a friend or someone that you view as an in-group member, as opposed to when you're talking to someone you've never met before and who might be marked in one way or another as an out-group member. It seems like it might make a difference. Have you looked at that? Have other people looked at that?
So I think I share the intuition that you might have different strategies of what you think you can get away with if you're lying to someone who knows you well. There might also be cases where, so there has been some work on whether listeners interpret disfluency differently if there's another alternative reason why they might have been disfluent. So someone who's having production difficulty, they've just heard a car horn beep outside, and so they pause in their speech, or they're a non-native speaker and they might have more trouble retrieving the word. Do these alternative explanations undermine the use of that cue to believe that that would be a lie? And if you're an in-group member, if you're a particularly if you understand what it's like to be a non-native speaker because you're a non-native speaker as well, hearing their disfluency, you might think, oh, I know what it's like to be searching for a word. That's a disfluency that I would discount. It's not as likely to be a lie. But actually, some of the things we've been finding is that this disfluency equals deception bias seems very strong. And if you look at people's eye movements, as soon as they hear the disfluency in the object, they're looking to the one-humped camel or the two-humped camel or whatever it is, that they seem to use this cue pretty quickly, even though there could be an alternative explanation. So just somewhat relevant to that.
Thanks.
Question from Erica.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm sorry to be quiet, it's nap time here. But I'm wondering if you could actually speculate, I think, on maybe the opposite of what you were describing, which is linguistic cues or perceptions of cooperative intent. And specifically, I'm curious about how, say, a political figure might message in a way that makes them seem authentic. Hopefully they are authentic too, but wondering if you have any suggestions there for that particular application.
So if listeners hear disfluency and think that it's a symptom of deceit, then I guess avoiding that potential cue is an option. This is making me think about how I don't have a great answer to this. It's making me think about how um, I, as I and the disfluencies, if disfluency is a marker of dealing with something that's complex to articulate, is it possible that we sometimes signal, we try to over signal that what we're saying is complex by lavishing on these disfluencies that might paint a picture of saying something complex? And so I don't know if a politician would want to shift between different modes where they talk up or they signal up the complexity of what they're saying or the simplicity of what they're saying based on their disfluency. Whether this is even within our control, I don't know. But it's a really cool question about what do people do, deceptively or not, to mark that something is um, that you don't need to read between the lines, that your message is exactly as it stands? Or do people feel a kinship with someone who they do the inferencing on? And I think advertisement often plays on this, where you have to make a mental leap, you have to get the pun, and then you feel really proud that you got it. And so then you feel this connection to what's been advertised. Lots of interesting things to get into.
Awesome. Question from Ruth.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really very interesting. I wonder how you would explain, now looking at political communication, somebody like Trump or Johnson, who are liars, yeah, and who do nothing else than lie, and obviously violate all the Gramscian maxims or all the conversational organization, etc. I mean, we know that from fact checkers that Trump lied about, I don't know, 16,000 XX times during his 4 years, and obviously doesn't show these markers which talked about, or he's so persuasive that people just believe what he says. And I'm wondering if the conventions or these Gramscian maxims can now be violated without anything happening. So there is no sanctions except, I mean, people believe it or the people don't believe it. So that's one question. I mean, how would we go about, and I'm wondering myself how to analyze this from a pragmatic point of view. If somebody just does it, and because of his power and charisma or whatever, just is believed and it doesn't matter. And the other question is about what we know from other cultures where deception and lying is part of something which you learn to do when you defend yourselves against alleged enemies. For example, this is called in Arabic al-taqiyya. I don't know if I pronounced that rightly. And so it's something which you can do in certain contexts. Again, I wonder if these markers are present or if people are socialized to do this in a way that they deceive without being detected in any way.
So some of the things that this makes me think about. So I wonder if certain politicians believe that they are telling the truth, and so they fail to show any of the symptoms of lying because they actually believe it themselves. This is me just speculating. Whether or not whether or not Trump is abandoning Grice's maxims,
Yeah,
my
that's
hunch is that
could be
he's
the
not,
case.
in a sense, because I imagine that there are places where he does this thing of that many speakers do, of offering that there is additional meaning. When he says, you know what I mean, where there's additional meaning that he's not on record as having said. And so I think in that sense he's being cooperative. He's leaning on the cooperative rules to push meaning without actually being on record as having said it. Not to say that he's cooperative, but he is very, I think he may be aware of the how the cooperative game works. Speculating. The point about culturally where we may opt out of some of the maxims. I mean, I think it makes me think about how there are contexts where we where in English we might signal that why we can't uphold the maxim. So it would be expected to tell the truth, but you might have to say, I'm not in a position to say more. So you would mark that here is a time when I expect to violate these maxims, and we do it in a way that makes it, to make a long story short, you kind of acknowledge that this is perhaps an inappropriate quantity of information. So we have ways of signaling, I know that these are the rules, but I'm about to violate them in this strategic way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry for people who have questions still. That's the end, so we're gonna wrap up. But thank you, Hannah and Gail, for today's excellent talks. And we'll see all of you next week too, hopefully.